Should you be buying your investment properties through a limited company in 2025? This is what we're going to look at in this video because a lot of people are unsure, should they be buying in their own personal name or should they be buying in a limited company? Now, of course, it does very much depend on your personal tax situation, depends on how much you earn, depends on how many properties you want to buy, what kind of rental income you're going to generate. But I'm going to talk general principles here, which I think will be very useful for you if you want to become a more successful property investor. So let's look at how we used to invest in property. And prior to 2015, everybody used to buy property in their own name. Now, occasionally people did buy in a company structure if maybe they were doing a joint venture with someone else and they wanted that kind of structure for tax reasons. But generally people would buy in their own name for fundamentally two reasons. First of all, it was much easier to get mortgages in your own name. In a company structure prior to 2015, it was more expensive. You'd pay higher arrangement fees, higher fees to your solicitors, and also the interest rates were more, which would put people off putting properties into a company. So it was definitely easier and cheaper to get mortgages in your own name. The other main thing is that it was a tax advantage. You could offset all of the interest that you pay on your interest-only mortgage against the rental income, which will reduce the amount of profit you make and thus reduce the amount of tax you pay on your property investments. The other thing is when you would remortgage your property, you could take out a big lump of tax-free money and do whatever you wanted with that money. It really was quite incredible. That's why people used to invest in their own name. In 2015, the UK government announced they were going to change the way that we as property investors are taxed. They were going to introduce something called Section 24 to come into force in April 2017, phased over 4 years. And it was changing the way that we should own property. What they wanted to do was really to get people to own property in a company, in a corporate structure, I guess because they felt it was easy to tax and regulate against that. And the way they do that was say, basically, if you own property in your own name, which the vast majority of the 2 million plus landlords in the UK did, and if you had a mortgage, which again, at least 75% of those landlords have, and if you're a high rate taxpayer, which not all, but many property investors are, then you'd pay a lot more tax against your property income because you wouldn't be able to offset all of the interest you pay on your mortgage. Now, if you're a lower rate taxpayer, you're not actually affected by Section 24. So if you're only going to buy maybe one or maybe two properties, actually buying them in your own name might still be okay. If you want to build a portfolio enough to replace your income, to leave a legacy to your family, to your loved ones, then buying in a company structure is probably better for the reason you're going to be able to offset all of the interest to reduce the amount of tax you pay. And also, if you're providing a legacy to your family, you can have what's called a family investment company, where actually you have two types of shareholders. So obviously you have you as the main operator of the business. You can have your kids can have some shares, and they might have the majority of shares, but they're not having the voting shares. You still control the business. So over time, as you want to pass the properties on to your kids, you can do it in the structure. And if you do it in the correct tax way, you can minimize taxes such as inheritance tax. Now, I must say I'm not a tax advisor, and it's very important that when you're structuring anything, you go and get the correct tax advice based on your personal circumstances, what you want to achieve, because everybody's different. I'd also highly recommend that you find someone who is a property tax specialist. The average accountant, or certainly IFAs, they don't understand property, and they certainly don't understand property tax. My ex-partner, she had a property that she'd lived in for a number of years, and then she went to go and live and work in Dubai for 5 years. She rented her property out, and then when she came back to the UK, we got together, and she didn't really want to have a property in London. She actually moved up to her parents up in Nottingham. So she had this London property that she wanted to sell. Now, when you sell a property that's not your own home, you're going to pay capital gains tax on the gain, how it's gone up from what you bought it for, and then what you sell it for, less any buying and selling costs or any capital improvements. So you pay tax on that. Now, because she lived in the property for a number of years, there was actually an allowance that she could claim. And so when she got her accountant, who did her books for her business, to look at this, he worked out she was going to have to pay about £4,500 in capital gains tax. Now, I looked at it, I thought, well, I'm not sure that's right. Based on what I knew about property tax, and I'm not an expert, but I know a little bit, based on the numbers, I thought she wouldn't have to pay any tax at all. So I mentioned this to my ex-partner, and she mentioned it to her accountant, and he said, no, I'm right. And I thought, well, I'm not going to give up that easily. So I said to her, no, I think he should look into this. Apparently, he looked on the HMRC website. He couldn't find anything. And by the way, this tax accountant, or this accountant rather, he used to be an HMRC tax inspector. So you would think he would understand all about the different types of taxes and allowance, etc., etc. However, he came back and said, no, couldn't find it. He thought he was right. Now, I'm convinced I was right. I looked up some of my references that I got this information from, and I'm pretty sure there was this allowance. So should we push back one final time? He said he asked around a few colleagues, and actually, I was right. And actually, in this case, she didn't need to pay any tax. So this was her accountant, who was a former HMRC tax inspector, was saying she needed to pay a tax when actually that tax probably wasn't due because of the allowances she could claim. So my point here is you've got to be very careful when getting advice from an advisor. Obviously, we pay these people to save us money. You need to make sure they are fit for purpose and they have the correct skills and the correct experience. Tax is a big subject. I have a number of different advisors I use in different areas, and it's sometimes frustrating when they sometimes conflict each other. But you've got to listen to people, take your own opinion, but also make sure you are getting advice from people who really know what they're talking about. A standard accountant is not going to know about property tax. So that's one of the reasons we should buy in a company structure. A question I'm often asked is, do I need to have a different company for each different type of property? Well, no, you don't. There's two fundamental types of business you need to know about. There's what's called an investment business. That's the business that's going to hold all of your investment properties, your singlets, your HMOs, your blocks of flats, all the property you're holding long term are in your investment business. And you may also have a different type of business with a different SIC code that describes what the business does. And that might be a trading business. So that could be a business where you're selling deals, or you're doing rent to rent, or you're doing purchase lease options. That's seen as a trading activity, and it's separate from an investment business. It's very difficult to get a mortgage on a property in a trading business because there's a risk it could go out of business. So lenders want to lend you in an investment company. So if you do have a company, it's important to make sure you have the correct SIC code based on what you're trying to do. And again, your accountant who helps you set the business up will help you with that. You know, you can actually get a business set up for £15 online, but it may not be fit for purpose. And I think it's something you don't really want to try and save money on. I'd recommend you go and find a good tax accountant who can advise you on this. Maybe spend a few £100s with them, getting the right advice, getting the exact structure you need, and then you're set up for life, and you know you're going to be able to minimize your tax moving forward. It's a bit of a mindset thing. Many investors, they want to try and do things as cheap as possible. And I understand that, especially when you first start, money might be tight, but you need to understand the difference between a cost and a value mindset. A cost mindset is we're always looking at the cost of things, thinking, I can't afford to do that. And it's not a very positive reinforcement to say to yourself. By the way, if you find something that you think you don't have the money for, rather than saying, I can't afford that, a much better thing to say to yourself would be, how can I afford to pay for this? But when it comes to working with other people, very often property investors and landlords are, how can I put this? They're kind of tight. They don't like to spend money. I see people who are managing properties themselves because they don't want to pay a letting agent to do it. And actually managing a few properties is pretty easy. You can definitely do it in your spare time. However, the more properties you get, like me, you might fall into what's called the landlord trap. When I was first investing, I was managing properties myself because I didn't want agents to do it. I didn't want to pay them. I thought I could do a better job. And actually, I thought I'd quite like to get to meet my tenants. Let me tell you, that third reason, the novelty soon wears off. I now don't know who my tenants are. I really don't care. As long as somebody is looking after them and looking after the property, that's important. But it doesn't have to be me, and it doesn't have to be you. Now, of course, I pay people to look after my properties and my tenants, but that then frees up my time to go and buy more properties. And you make more money buying properties than you do renting properties. So for this reason, you need to start thinking about the value of things. What's the value of paying a letting agent to look after my properties rather than just looking at the cost of employing someone and what's going to cost you out of your pocket? So cost versus mindset, really important. So just to summarize, this video has all been about, should you use a company when investing in property in 2025? And my answer is, for most people, absolutely yes. It's now much easier to get mortgages. They're very competitive within a company. You get to offset all the interest you pay on your mortgage against the rental income to reduce your profit and thus reduce the tax. And also it's good to structure it in a way you can pass the legacy on to your loved ones. I hope that video has been useful. If it has, please like the video. Also make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon to make sure you're notified anytime a brand new video comes out. Until next time, I encourage you to invest with knowledge, invest with skill.